Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, Kieran O'Connor. On a recent episode of the podcast, I sat down with Wilk Wilkinson, a Trump supporter and a leader with Braver Angels' We the People's Project, for a wide-ranging conversation about the FBI's recent search of Mar-a-Lago, why conservatives are so angry about the FBI's investigations into former President Trump, and what the rule of law means in a country this polarized. The episode got a lot of feedback. Dozens of Blue members of Braver Angels wrote in to express outrage. They said that I didn't do enough to challenge Wilk on his positions. And I can see where they're coming from. It's difficult for me to be both a host and a participant in the debate. And in retrospect, I would have preferred to moderate a conversation about Mar-a-Lago between Wilk and a strong Blue voice rather than try to play both roles. And that is a good lesson for me and our team going forward. We also got some feedback from Red members who said they feel like we've been doing a lot of content on President Trump, but very little on President Biden. They said they want to see a Biden supporter in the hot seat, a Biden supporter to get challenged and engage critiques that they have on the right. Well, fair enough, I said, let's do it. So today I've got Wilk back on the podcast, except this time he's going to begin the conversation in the role of interviewer, talking to my good friend, former Obama campaign staffer, and current Biden supporter, Jordan Carmon. I've asked Wilk to come up with a set of questions to start the conversation, and then we can move into more of a free-flowing discussion. I'll be here to moderate, but mostly I'll be here to listen and learn. So, Wilk, I'm going to pass the mic over to you, but first I want to give the two of you a chance to do brief introductions. I'll start with you, Jordan. Tell us who you are and why you decided to do this podcast today.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. My name is Jordan Carmon, and I live in New York. I work in politics, and that's actually how I met Kieran back in 2012 when we were working on the Obama campaign in Chicago. I was a very young kid back then, and since then we've remained friends and often have talked about politics just in, while playing, being at the gym or just as, banter. And I wanted to come on the podcast because, I've found myself often, talking and defending President Biden and a lot of the things that he's been doing as president. And I think, he's gotten a little bit of a bad rap off in the media. And so I thought it would be interesting or not in the media, rather, more in like the public discourse. And so I thought it would be interesting to come on and talk with someone with a different perspective and try to maybe find some common ground, but also understand where we're coming from.
Well, thank you for coming, Jordan, and agreeing to be in the hot seat of sorts. Wilk, I think at this point, a lot of our audience already knows who you are, but why don't you just briefly tell them who you are, why you decided to do this, and then you can jump right into the conversation and kick us off.
Yeah, well, thank you again, Kieran. I appreciate the opportunity again to be here. I am Wilk, host of the D-Rate the Hate podcast, and like you said earlier, leader in the We the People's Project for Braver Angels. I always love the opportunity to do things like this. The reason that I do this podcast and my podcast is because the discourse among people in our country of differing opinions these days has taken a turn for the worse. And it doesn't seem to be getting a lot better. So organizations like ours, Braver Angels, are doing such important work trying to bridge that divide, put the unity back in our community, and I think it's important to have conversations. So I'm very glad to be here today with you, Kieran, and especially for having Jordan here for this conversation.
Cool. Well, Wilk, the mic is yours. I'll be on the fly in the wall. I might jump in, but over to you.
All right, great. Well, Jordan, again, thank you. Thank you for being here, and it's nice to meet you this morning. My first question for you as a Obama staffer back in the day, and now a Joe Biden supporter, would be, what are your feelings or what are your thoughts about career politicians who have probably never really done anything in the private sector, but spent their whole lives in politics and become exorbitantly wealthy doing so?
Thank you for the question, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Yeah, and so first off, I want to just clarify, because while we did meet at the Obama campaign, I wasn't actually a staffer. I was actually an intern, so I don't want to overstate my work there. I was very committed and did volunteer on both campaigns, but I have worked in public service for the last 5 years, and so I do have thoughts on that. Just to clarify, I work for the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office as a senior advisor for communications and policy. I previously worked in Nassau County and at the State Attorney General's office. So I think when you are in a position of public trust, and especially if you're in a position of public authority, you need to take proactive steps to make sure that the public can trust that you are making a decision for the right reasons and not for your portfolio. For example, that's why all presidents, with the exception of Donald Trump, release their tax returns to the public. I think people can see that members of Congress have stock portfolios that perform better than the general public. They are right to be skeptical, and I think that members of Congress should be barred from trading stocks while they're in office. And there is growing bipartisan support for that, and so we've probably already found common ground on that. But I think I would push back against the notion that having said that career politicians are inherently bad, and that we necessarily need more leaders with experience in business. And the reason why I say that is because most of America's greatest presidents have had zero business experience. They were career politicians, lawyers, or both. And that includes Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, FDR. And in the last 100 years or so, there have been 3 presidents that have touted their business experience as their primary qualifications for running for office. That was Herbert Hoover, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump. And all 3 of those administrations were managerial disasters that ended in historic economic despair. So I guess, I personally hope that people will think twice the next time someone comes around promising to run the government like a business. I don't believe that they are the same thing. I do think, I do want to reiterate that there is a problem of people in office, being able to, there being a revolving door. But I would, it's connected also to the fact of, the money that is outside of politics that floods in just as equally as the money that is made outside of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it makes some sense, and you made some really good points there, Jordan. One thing I did want to ask real quick, because I found it interesting that you brought up the historic economic despair after the Trump administration. So just real quick, and I don't want to make this conversation about Trump so much, but I do want to just get some clarification on that point. Mm-hmm. The historic economic despair that you referred to after the Trump administration, where does that come from, do you think? And please clarify that particular one, because I know that because of the pandemic and because of the unprecedented lockdowns and the government overreach upon the individual and upon the business sector, that is what caused the vast majority of what would have been a economic boondoggle at the end of the Trump administration. But really, that had began to skyrocket out of that doldrum before he left office. So just give me just a quick clarification on that, if you could, Jordan.
Yeah, sure. I would say that, the despair was very much related to the fact that, I think the month that Biden took office, there were already more deaths in America from COVID-19 than all the deaths combined in World War II from our troops. And so I think, that despair certainly was pandemic related. I would argue that the pandemic, both in terms of the health and safety of the American people, as well as our economic situation, was exacerbated by Trump's mismanagement of the pandemic. And so it is true that a lot of the economic malaise, we had, I think it was the unemployment rate was about double what it is right now when Trump left office. People were there were no vaccines, or rather, I think vaccines had been distributed to about like 1% of the population. And so the despair was, I think, a lack of hope for the future, right? I think the country was in a darker place at that time after he left office for several reasons, not just purely economic. I think, the attack at the Capitol, the, raging of COVID, the poor employment situation, I think all of it contributed to a general sense of despair that I think had to do with Donald Trump's mismanagement.
Okay. Well, that we will certainly disagree upon, but we can move on from there. That's no problem.
We'll get to it.
Yeah,
I'm already having fun.
Yeah, no, that is definitely a point which we will not agree on, and that's perfectly all right. Yeah.
But would you agree though? Because I think Donald. I'll be credit where it's due that the economy was performing better under Trump in 2018 and 19. Right, a lot of things in general were going well. For example, crime. Right, in New York City, we had historic crime lows in 2019, and a lot of things were going well then. I think a lot of people also agree things weren't. There were problems still with the economy. But since then, right, under Biden, he released an economic report this week. There have been 10 million new jobs, and a lot of it has had to do with specifically the economic policies like the American Rescue Plan that were put in, that has put America in a sort of unique position where we are, the dollar is at its strongest level ever. Investors are pouring money here. You look across the globe, and in England and in China, they're going through serious economic crisis. Their inflation rates are twice of what we have, and their energy bills are dramatically higher. And we are in a place that we are much more stable. We have historically low unemployment, and a lot of it has to do with, yes, I think the stimulus package that Trump passed in 2020 was an important part of stabilizing the economy. But then, the support for families as a result of the American Rescue Plan and the specifically for the people at the lower end, which is which created, I think, a more equitable recovery. JP Morgan actually estimated that the bottom 25% of households in March of 2022 had an average of a 65% higher income in their checking account balances than they did in 2019. Right. So there's actually, evidence that, for a lot of people, the situation is marginally improved compared to before the pandemic. And so I do think that is a sign that, would you agree then that we are in a place, a better place in the economy at this point, in part because of some of the actions that have been taken?
Not Biden? Really. No, I wouldn't think so. I don't think so, because I know that my dollar goes less, my dollar does less now than it did 2 years ago, 4 years ago, even 6 years ago. But the fact is we're at a 40-year high in inflation. The dollar you talked about being stronger now, I don't see it. The people that I talk to don't see it. I talk to a lot of working class people that are out there, and I certainly don't follow the numbers and on all the things the way that you do, Jordan. And I'm not going to lie about that. I'm more of a people person than a numbers person. I'm more of a people person than a politics person. So I look what's going on Main Street America here in the Midwest, and the stuff that you're saying sounds good, but it's just not the reality that I see on the streets among the working class people, and hear from the stories that people are talking about at their dinner tables here in rural America and working class America. So I appreciate what you're saying, but it's just not the reality for the majority of people in this country. Um, when I look at when I look at the the policies of the Biden administration and where the American Recovery Act or their latest thing where they're printing a whole bunch more money and throwing it in there for this Inflation Reduction Act and things like that. You know, when a country prints a bunch of money that is not backed by anything other than the good faith of a bunch of politicians who by all rights don't have any credibility, it doesn't really do a lot for the value of the dollar, and we still have a lack of goods in this country. So when you increase the money supply and decrease the goods and services that are being supplied by that country, the dollar doesn't remain strong. So we're going into a recession. We know that because the economy is shrinking, and hopefully it turns out good. But when I talk to the people that I talk to, it's really not looking that way. So I mean, remains to be seen. I mean, I hear these stories about, and I hear the talks about, well, we're building a more stable and level economy, and then they try to mince words and change the definition of certain things, but it's just not what I see on Main Street. So.
Mm-hmm. So a fair point, and I don't want to discount, like, inflation is a serious problem, and I'm not saying that it isn't, right? I think it's part of the sort of it is a global phenomenon that when I said what's going on overseas, it's just the reality, right? Other countries have hunger crises right now. You have countries collapsing right now out of instability, and so that doesn't make the pain that people are feeling here less valid. I'm just saying in terms of analyzing the amendment on the ground level, though. Gas has fallen $1.25 this summer, and falling at the fastest rate ever. So things are getting better. Prices marginal, like even in July, it seems like hopefully they seem to have moderated. But things are still very difficult. But what I would say is that there is a how would I put this? That actually, I want to focus actually, because the one thing I wanted to push back on was the Inflation Reduction Act, because I'm just curious, because you characterized it a little differently than how I would think about it. But that's I think, for example, that was something that Trump promised to do, was to have Medicare negotiate like crazy. But it was actually Biden that did it, and it's tangible legislation to improve people's lives. It's going to lower the cost of prescription drugs by hundreds, sometimes thousands of people per year for Medicare beneficiaries, like my dad. It caps insulin at $35 a month. I think that's pretty like Main Street, like kind of things that people actually care about. They want government to help them. And that just there, I think it saved a lot of people hundreds of dollars on their insurance premiums. And so I agree with you. The things that people care about aren't these high level economic numbers. They care about what are you doing to actually materially improve my life. And so I do think that, back to what I was saying in terms of the good management, sometimes you don't see these things immediately in your life, right? I think the infrastructure bill is a good example of that, right? Would you agree, for example, right, that it was important, because this is also something that Donald Trump promised to do, was pass a big infrastructure bill, and it was Biden that actually managed to do it, and it was the biggest investment we've made since the Eisenhower administration. Yes, it's a lot of money. I would argue that rebuilding our roads and our bridges and our ports and our airports and our modes of transportation was an important investment to make, and that it was good. Would you feel the same way? Did you support it?
I don't know enough about the specifics of that bill, I'll be honest with you, Jordan, to know how much of it I support. When I do look at most federal bills, and especially federal spending bills, I see far more in there that I don't support than things that I do support. And And so, but that one specifically, I don't really want to talk about just because I don't know enough about it. And that's just me being completely honest. But when
Yeah.
I do, like I
If
said,
you
when I
don't,
do look at
yeah.
most of these federal spending bills, I see so much more in there. But that's just because in my nature, Jordan, in my nature, I look at a lot of these things and I say, these are things that the government has no business being involved in. And when the government continues to flood pet projects,
Yeah.
of lobbyists and certain politicians, flood money into these pet projects that really have that the federal government has no business being part of, it hurts every American. Well, not every American. I take that back. It doesn't hurt every American. It just hurts the majority of Americans that are out there working their asses off every single day to try and make a living and put food on their table. The people that are exorbitantly rich, like politicians and the majority of, and those other ones, they are generally not hurt by those. They generally benefit from those. So it's when it comes to that, it's really about cronyism, and it hurts the majority of the Americans, and in the name of trying to help them or supposedly helping them. So, but that specific one, I don't know enough about.
So yeah, I did some research last night on this because I wanted to actually try to look, because it's, we haven't yet spoken, we didn't meet, and I know you're from Minnesota, and I was like trying to like think about like like the what has been going on in terms of like administration policy, and what are important things for in your area of the country. And obviously, we're coming from different places politically, so we're definitely seeing things differently. But I think like paving roads and like rebuilding broken bridges are like a very non-political thing, or rather something that I think that all people kind of should agree that government does. And the infrastructure bill, they have like this lookup tool where you can look up all the different states. And in Minnesota, I know it's the land of 10,000 lakes. There are 661 bridges and over 5,000 miles of highway in poor condition. Since 2011, they say that commute times have increased by 10%. And on average, every driver is paying $543 because of the costs due to the roads in need of despair. And that bill is delivering them a lot of money, delivering Minnesota a lot of money to rebuild those highways. So, I guess, obviously, details aside, a lot of things I concede can get caught up in these federal programs that have corruption, and like I don't want to like discount that, right? But that policy objective, right? I think that is the essence, I think, of my defense of Biden, is that he is doing the nuts and bolts of government very well, right? And the politics aside, and I agree that there are politics, right, that make it, I think, hard for a lot of people to access and maybe see themselves as benefiting from it, because we're in this like polarized world where if Biden is passing it, it must mean that it's bad for me. But I do think that like some of the things that he's doing, and the infrastructure bill is a good example, are good for all Americans, red or blue.
Yeah, and when it comes to Joe Biden, I think about the old phrase, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Yeah. And when I think about, Joe Biden and I want to get more into the questions that that we were, as far as the conversation at hand today, it was really about what got you to initially support Biden, because when I was asked what initially got me to support Trump, the idea was, I didn't initially support Trump. I didn't like his persona. I didn't like the way he interacted with the other candidates, blah, blah, blah. But I did support him. And I do think he governed in a phenomenal way and did great things for the country during his administration. That was my thing. And when people say that they supported Biden and he got more votes than any presidential candidate in history, I didn't, I can't get my mind around that, Jordan. I just, it's not something that I can understand, because again, when I look at Main Street America, when I look at the people that I talk to, and I look at the actions of Joe Biden on stage, over the past couple of years, I'm like,
Mhm.
I don't look at this guy as somebody that 81 million Americans were enthusiastically jumping out there to support. I mean,
Yeah.
literally, when even when I look back at Obama, Barack Obama as a candidate was this charismatic speaker. He was very eloquent and had this message of hope and change, which whatever it wasn't really hope and change. But when I look at that, I'm like, okay, this guy had what it takes as a politician to stand up there and grab the vote and really get in front of people and get people enthusiastic about voting for him.
Mhm.
When I look at Joe Biden, especially the Joe Biden of the past couple of years, nobody could look at him and say he was charismatic. Nobody could look at him and say he had the eloquence of this incredible politician. And his message was basically, I'm not Trump, and we've spent the last 5 years making you hate Trump. I'm not Trump. Come out and vote for me. So then there was like 2 or 3 Joe Biden signs for every 1,000 Donald Trump signs in yards and in neighborhoods and billboards and stuff like that. So could you explain for me, Jordan, what
Mhm.
your appeal for Joe Biden was as opposed to just hating Trump?
Sure. So I have a few thoughts. I think first I share with you that also when going into the primary, Joe Biden wasn't my first choice for president either. And I think you mentioned a few things there. I think that first off, we are, I think where you are, it might be hard to find a person who thinks that Joe Biden is doing a good job, right? Where I am, it's hard to find a person that doesn't think that the Donald Trump presidency wasn't like some historic crisis for this country. A lot of people felt very differently, I think, based off of both the different kinds of people. And this is, I think, just reflective of the growing divide. I think in between like urban and rural and various different parts of the country, that and it's like a shame because I do think that often people miss the opportunity to like hear from the other side about why they're genuinely for him, and they just kind of consume this caricature of him through the media, through media that kind of like misrepresents who the person is. And I concede that that's kind of similar for Trump as well, right? That a lot of left-leaning media gave this impression, get like kind of highlighted and amplified Trump's worst moments when he said stupid stuff. And I think the same thing is also true, though, for conservative media that kind of presents this very distorted, I think, portrayal of Biden often. And it kind of, and having gotten the chance to meet him personally, I think it's, it bothers me because, how do I put this? There's this kind of phenomenon that I've seen of viral videos that clips Biden out of context, obviously to fuel this narrative that he's senile and incompetent. Biden grew up stuttering, and that his stutter still remains unknown to many Americans. I think makes it pretty easy for his opponents to make these fake but convincing clips. And I bring this up because I can think of so many examples of times I just saw these videos run, like spread like wildfire, shared by all my high school friends on Facebook and my parents' friends who are sharing them, and then my dad sending them asking me, "Is this real?" And one of them was a video that Donald Trump Jr. shared 10 days before the election, that it showed Biden, or sorry, 10 days before his inauguration, and it showed Biden looking really confused about where to go after an event ended. And he's like looking, he's like, where do I go now? And the idea is like, oh, he's old and senile. But that only showed 19 seconds from the event, and it zoomed in on Biden. And then the result was that the people didn't see that Biden was actually waiting for others to leave the stage before him. That was what was going on. Or then another one that I saw a couple of weeks ago was Biden was at a press conference, and I think he was reading a quote from the CEO of Walmart, And he said end of quote, and everybody just grabbed that part where he says end of quote as if he just was reading off the teleprompter, but they didn't show that he started saying and I quote, right, and then said end of quote, right, but they cut off the part where he said it at the beginning. So that is just to say, I think people should be wary of clips that are cut really short with no clear context that are aimed at triggering emotional reactions.
So I think a point of common ground. I think a point of common ground here, Jordan, is that social media and the mainstream media are a dumpster fire of hate, lies, and misinformation. Right? I mean, that's So I just wanted to throw that in there real quick. Go ahead. I didn't mean to step on.
No. I appreciate that. You should feel free to step in as I talk, because I often have a tendency to do the same to the people who I'm talking about. It's just my parents are from Israel, and it's kind of like part of the cultural way of talking. Sure. So I wanted to though address the part about his sort of charisma or lack thereof. He does have this, because in the 2020 election, he has this saying, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And you're right. A lot of his message was inherently about Trump. I think he's not the kind of person who can create a cult of personality like Obama or like Trump, right? And for better or for worse, people just don't get as worked up about Joe Biden and aren't invested as emotionally in Joe Biden as they are in Donald Trump and Barack Obama. And I think that was actually that played in his favor during the election. I think the country was generally exhausted by the sort of the Trump presidency and the instability of it, and I think people wanted somebody that had government experience in contrast to somebody who had just not had any experience. And they wanted somebody who, evoked empathy. Biden is somebody who's gone through a lot of personal tragedy in his life. And I think it's instilled in him that empathy and resilience that speaks to a lot of people and allows him to connect with people on a very human level. I wouldn't undercount that as, the context in which he was successful as a political candidate, despite everybody doubting him, right? And I think you're right about the fact that there weren't a lot of Joe Biden signs during the primary or even during the general election. But there is how do I put this? I almost felt like during that time, there was this silent majority in the country of people who were just exhausted and people who were done and who didn't want to talk about it, specifically because it is this source of division. I think it's really sad that there is that, so many families that have become estranged and friends who don't talk to each other anymore because of the 2016 election or the 2020 election. And so, you understand why a lot of people, especially in some places, like you said, you don't see any Biden signs, right? Well, would you want to be a Biden supporter putting up a sign if you're the only one, right? Like, I think that, especially given that level of animosity, and quite frankly, the political environment was so charged, and you saw that leading into January 6th, that I think a lot of people, just spoke with their vote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you made a good point there, Jordan, about, would you want to put a Biden sign in if you're in a sea of Trump supporters? Now, in my experience, I've over the course of my life and the things that I've seen, especially here in Minnesota, because in outstate Minnesota, there's virtually no, the state of Minnesota specifically, there's virtually no real representation in our government for the majority of the state of Minnesota, because the state of Minnesota is governed by Minneapolis, St. Paul, as if it was Minneapolis, St. Paul. But the reality is the majority of the state is rural and doesn't have anything in common with Minneapolis, St. Paul. But if somebody if a Biden supporter from Minneapolis, St. Paul comes to outstate Minnesota and parks their car in a parking lot full of Trump supporters or full of conservative Republican Americans, they're probably not going to worry about their car. But if somebody with a Trump bumper sticker drives into the city and parks their car in a parking lot, there's a very good chance they're going to have broken windows, scratched up car, flattened tires, that kind of thing. So it's one of those things where I don't think a lot of people are getting grief for being a Biden supporter, but the converse is very true in many cases. So, but you made some great points there, and one of the things that I really want to touch on, because it brings to mind a lot of the reason that I started the Derate the Hate podcast, is that division and the way that it's ripped families and friendships apart. And that's one of the big reasons I became part of the Braver Angels organization, is because all that contentious nastiness that politics has driven into a lot of our personal relationships has been absolutely horrible. And I want to find ways with not only my podcast, but doing my part with Braver Angels to fix part of that. So thank you for bringing that up, because it's become such an ugly part of this, and hate is such a big part of politics now. And especially the speech that Joe Biden gave the other day that was so charged with hate, it was just disgusting. And I want to ask you some questions about that.
Can I make one point first? Just
yeah,
one
absolutely. Go ahead. Yep. Yeah.
Just about like how could Joe Biden win so many votes? And again, this is me speaking about the macro, not the micro, right?
Sure.
We have both our own experiences and in our corners of the country, but being honest about just like vote totals, I think there is a Democratic advantage. I think personally, I think because the Democratic policies and ideas and approach to government are more popular, but the Democratic candidate has won the popular vote 7 out of the last 8 presidential elections. Obviously we don't have an advantage in terms of how the winners are actually decided, but Hillary Clinton was a very imperfect candidate. And I imagine that you don't have the highest opinion of her, but she actually won 3 million more votes than the other person, right? And so that kind of, I'm not saying that, like, I think that sort of just speaks to the fact that, even with a candidate that is, people might not have liked, even then the Democratic candidate still won a lot of votes. And I think that just speaks to the fact that, most people in America live in concentrated population centers, and they like generally are Democratic. And I think that it's a shame that I think in general people, because there's this increased, people want to live around people who share the same values and everything. Like you said, not seeing other people and in front of you, it allows that denormalization that makes it a lot easier to, like you said, cast somebody out of your life when they don't agree with you politically or anything. And as partisan as I am, I concede, I'm a proud Democrat and I work in Democratic politics, but at the same time, you can have political disagreements with people in your life and not hold back, right? And be honest and let out your frustration, right? And then learn how to remain civil and even if you do or are not civil, to agree to disagree and agree that you're going to be citizens in the same country.
Yeah,
right?
disagree
and
amicably.
And you're playing by the same rules, right?
Yeah,
that's basically it.
Yep. Yeah. No. And you made a beautiful point there, Jordan. And you kind of made it without saying it, but I think the beautiful thing about one thing that you just said there was the importance of the Electoral College, because if you look at the county maps in this country and the geography of our country and the main population centers, which are overridden by crime and debt and things like that right now, but if you look at those population centers, if the rest of the country constantly had to be governed, and it goes to the same point that I made earlier about the whole state of Minnesota being governed as if it was the same place as Minneapolis, St. Paul, the values, the lifestyle, the different things that people deal with in everyday life are not the same for the people in outstate Minnesota as they are for the people in Minneapolis, St. Paul. The people in outstate New York are not dealing with the same everyday issues that the people in Buffalo are, or the people in New York City are, and the people in outstate Illinois are not dealing with the same issues every single day that the people in Chicago are. So it speaks to the importance of the Electoral College and why we have the electoral system that we have. And I agree. I mean, people get upset, people get worked up, and sometimes rightfully so, about the fact that the last 7 presidential candidates, the Democrat won. But that's why. But it's a good point, and I think we can probably have some common ground there too. And I'm glad we got to talk about that a little bit. So let me ask you a couple more questions about Joe Biden. I know we're getting kind of the end of our time here, but one of the big things
already.
Yeah, right. No, I mean this conversation could go on for hours, and actually I'm enjoying it, Jordan. I think this kind of conversation for me is incredible, and I have no problem having conversations with people. I have no problem having conversations with people I don't agree on anything with, let alone somebody like you and I who can, amicably have a conversation about this type of stuff. And it's productive. It's much better than the toxicity that we see online in social media. It's much better than the nightmarish hyperbole we see from all the clowns in mainstream media and all the alphabet soup kind of stuff. This is what makes a difference in the world, and this is what we need more of. So I agree. So my question here, Jordan, or my next couple of questions have to do with the fact that everybody likes to talk about Trump's personality and his dishonesty and all of this. And they talk constantly about how he's such a liar and blah, blah, blah. And, or things like, he wouldn't disclose his tax returns, or he lied about this, or he said this about women or whatever. Okay. They always go on these ad hominem attacks that they just want to attack Trump and his personality. But the reality is if we look at Joe Biden's past, if we look at things that are happening, not just in his past, but in his current life, we could probably find, or not probably, there's videotaped. I mean, there's just, much like Trump, who didn't spend his life in government, much like Trump, a lot of Joe Biden's life has been on tape or audio recorded or video recorded and things like that. So we can look back and see that Joe Biden has talked or lied several times to the American people, right? And so let me ask you a question about this. So and we've already agreed on the fact that the media, both social and mainstream, is very dishonest in the way that they portray Trump and the way that they portray Joe Biden. I think we can both agree on that. But there's certain things like going back to the election in 1988, where Joe Biden was accused of and proved to be a plagiarist, right? And then, talking about his college transcripts and how he said he graduated in the top of his class when he actually graduated in the bottom of his class when it came to law school. And things like that. So talk to me a little bit, Jordan, about your thoughts on that. And I will be the first one to say I am all about redemption for people who have stood up and genuinely apologized for the things that they've done in their past life. In fact, I've had several of those people on my podcast. But Joe Biden has actually made a career out of politics, making money off of the American people in politics, and lying to get the positions that he has. And there's just a lot of it out there. So talk to me about that and how that relates to all the people that want to ignore that, but point out all the misgivings of Trump.
Yeah. We certainly see things differently on this one. But I would say, no, to engage with it though. I think let me start with a metaphor. I think this kind of reminds me of, like, say you're a police officer and you're patrolling the highway for speeding, and in this scene I see kind of like Trump going 105 in a 65, right? and like Biden, going 10, 15 miles above the speed limit. They're both speeding, right? But to equate them is kind of, I think I wouldn't do it because I just think the scale is different. And so let me talk about it though. The college records, the plagiarism, lying about your college records, plagiarism in the 88 campaign and other things in the past, I think it's fair game. And I think, but I think it's fundamentally different from the scale of the impact of Trump's lies. And the reason why is because, well, we've had many presidents who have stretched the truth about their military records, about their voting records or their grades in college. I don't think we've never had what I saw as a con man president, somebody who was actively also dishonest during office. I believe both with the American people, but often again with his supporters in a way that I found shocking. And so I also, being honest, I believe that his dishonesty with the American people during the pandemic cost a lot of people their lives. And so I guess I just see the scale of their lies on a different level. Trump is under criminal investigation in multiple jurisdictions. And people think that it's biased and everything, and that it is a witch hunt against him. But this is a court of law where you need to provide probable evidence that a crime has been committed in front of like either a jury or a judge. And these aren't, you can rail against American institutions and the rule of law and everything and the FBI, but there is a fundamental difference in terms of the dishonesty across the board. I think in terms of scale, I do concede the points you've made in the past of Biden making some mistakes that reflect poorly on his character, and I think remind a lot of people of just your typical politician, right? Which I think then informs people's desire for somebody who's completely different, right? Like Trump, who's maybe more, I think they saw him as like more honest about the fact that he's not perfect, right? And I think that's maybe refreshing to some people. And so I understand that, but I think you probably agree, something we probably agree on is that we value, like you were talking about, results and actual tangible, like what are you actually doing, not your personality and like what you're everything. And the ultimate point of honest, like, but Trump promised to do all these things. He promised about the manufacturing, right? He said he was going to be the great manufacturing. He often just lied about a lot of these things. Like as president, he did almost nothing to bring back the dying industrial towns that he claimed that he would save. And even, so for example, this is a tangible thing, right? About the manufacturing jobs that are now coming onshore in America, right? With the semiconductor industry, the new facilities that are being announced in Ohio with Intel and Idaho of Micron and Toyota and Honda. Like we are actually, it sounds corny, but we're actually doing a lot of the things now that Trump promised to do about making the things of the future, the EVs, chips, fiber optics here in America, right? And that I think is ironic, but I just bring it up to say that like that's the kind of where the honesty matters, and like what you do as president ultimately is the biggest thing that we're judging, not necessarily things that happened 30 years ago and so forth. It's about the present and the future.
Yeah, and I think we'd probably look at those things a little bit differently. I'm incredibly happy and very grateful that a lot of those manufacturing jobs are coming back to the country. I think a lot of the groundwork for that was laid under the Trump administration, but we'll probably disagree on that. But the reality is, I think that a lot of that groundwork was done during the Trump administration, but regardless of when it started, when it's happening, the reality is if it's coming back to America, it's important, and I think that we can agree on that because it's better for our country. So you mentioned criminal investigations and the FBI and stuff. Mm-hmm. So the one last thing I want to touch on before we Sure. wrap up our conversation, Jordan, is Hunter Biden. Mm-hmm. Hunter Biden has been a very polarizing figure in Joe Biden's life. Hunter Biden's laptop and the information within that laptop was suppressed before the election by the FBI and the media. And the reality that Hunter Biden is under criminal investigation, and so much of what was said about Hunter Biden by Joe Biden, making the claim that he had never discussed his son's business dealings, which is a flat out lie. We know that one's pretty bad. And the fact that there is a lot that has come out now that should have been out prior to the election, but they said, oh, it's Russian disinformation, which we now know is a lie, and things like that. Talk a little bit about that particular thing, because when it comes to criminal investigations and it comes to presidential influence and things like that I think is a little bit more on the doing 105 and a 55 than a little 5 or 10 miles an hour over the speed limit.
Yeah. Thank you for engaging with my metaphor. So I think I disagree, because and I listened to the where this came from is the Mark Zuckerberg's interview with Joe Rogan. I actually went and listened to the entire podcast, to hear it for myself. And that is he did not say that the FBI covered up tried to suppress the information. And I sort of thought this might come up, so I went and I found the conversation. He said that the FBI came to members of the Facebook team and said, hey, you should be on high alert. We thought there could be Russian propaganda. We have it on notice that that something could happen. Be vigilant. The FBI didn't warn them specifically about Hunter Biden's laptop, but Facebook determined that it fit the pattern. And so they did reduce the distribution of the posts for about a week about Hunter Biden's laptop. And then after no one was able to say that it was false, they let it go. And, I'm a weekend subscriber to the New York Times. I have my copy here. I'm, I consume the liberal media. I was reading a lot about Hunter Biden's laptop in the last week of the election. And it was in the New York Times. It was actually being covered. Obviously, some people were saying there isn't any evidence of this or anything, but what I would say is that there was a election year investigation by the Senate Republicans led by Senator Ron Johnson into this entire thing, right? And they wanted to find something really badly and about the corruption allegations on Joe and Hunter involving Ukraine. And they found no evidence of improper influence or wrongdoing by the vice president, right? It did find that Hunter Biden cashed in on his father's name to close lucrative business deals, and that his work for Burisma did create the appearance of a conflict of interest, but they weren't able to find anything that said that Biden was improperly manipulating American policy towards Ukraine or committing any other misdeeds. In fact, the things that he was doing in Ukraine at the time, nobody ever talks about this, but was against the interests that his son was working for. But whatever. I think what's more important is that, it is important that, people get held accountable for whatever that they do, and that they're not treated specially. He is under investigation. I think we have a history in this country of a lot of difficulty with the sons of presidents and what that ends up happening. George W. Bush, if you look back in 1998, in the early 90s, when George H.W. Bush was president, his dad was accused of peddling foreign influence in Bahrain, and the Bahrainis pouring money into him, right? So, this is this happens often, and it is a problem. And I also think it's a problem, right, that Jared Kushner got a $2 billion investment from the Saudis after, managing the most pro-Saudi administration policy for 4 years, right? I'm not trying to what about, right? We can hold both of these things. But, I know Hunter Biden is talked about a lot in conservative media. And I think that it is certainly, I will certainly concede that if Hunter Biden, if the shoe was on the other foot and he was the Republican son, there would be more coverage in liberal leaning media, right? But at the same time, Hunter Biden wasn't on the ballot in 2020. And, Trump went to extreme efforts. Republicans went to extreme efforts to find the dirt, right? To find the evidence. He withheld military aid to Ukraine to extort them to get that dirt. And they weren't able to uncover the evidence of Joe Biden engaging in the corruption that they seem to say. And so, quite frankly, you were saying a lot of this is coming up now, right? I think a lot of it is coming up now, trying to discredit the FBI, because a lot of people put Trump first and defend him first. And they're going to go on television to and I've seen Ron DeSantis and a lot of Republicans, in my opinion, against their political interest, defend Trump through systematic misdirection and attacking the integrity of U.S. institutions of law enforcement. So I don't discount or try to dismiss, crime. Like, he should be held accountable for any kind of misdeeds that he's doing, and I hope the Justice Department pursues a fair and pursues that case without fear or favor. But I do think that there's a little bit of a Hunter Biden industrial complex. I saw that Breitbart just made a movie about him. So there's little sign of a recession. It's in boom times, and I think it's a little bit. I think it's a little bit of misdirection, and I think I see I get emails from conservative groups that try to fundraise off of him. I think that's natural in partisan politics, but I just don't think there is a there like some people think there is.
Okay, well, yeah, and it remains to be seen. I mean, we'll see how it all shakes out.
Remains exactly, yeah. It is still under investigation, and I don't want to do things, but I obviously attribute the same level of, I think, importance to the Hunter Biden issue as a lot of folks I know on the other side do. And I try to not to try to be honest about it, but based on the facts, I just don't see it.
Okay. I want to jump in here because we're coming to the end of our conversation, and I want to give both of you a chance just to check out and say how you're feeling. But the last thing I wanted to make sure we cover, because I know Wilk brought it up and we didn't get to it, was Joe Biden's recent speech, because Joe Biden did run as a uniter. I think bipartisanship is something that Joe Biden's talked about for a long time. At the same time, Joe Biden has never been shy about criticizing Donald Trump. He recently gave a speech that a lot of conservatives found objectionable because they felt like he was maybe painting with a broad brush and criticizing a lot of folks who support Trump. Wilk, can you talk a little bit about what your reaction to that speech was, and then maybe your question for Jordan? We can end with that.
Yeah, so I listened to that speech a couple times because, first of all, I was shocked that somebody gave it. I was not only shocked at the audio of it, but the visual representation of what Joe Biden did there was just disgusting, in my opinion. When I look at that, the military guard behind him and his just outright hatred for what he calls MAGA Republicans, and then going to the fact that in a speech earlier in the week or the week before, he talked about, you right wingers, holding on to your guns isn't going to be enough. You'd need an F-15 to fight the United States. These things are threats of violence towards Trump supporters, in my opinion. And it does no service to the people who, like I said, I've talked about it on my podcast. I go to machine shops and welding fabrication shops and things all over all over the Midwest, and I've seen people, I've talked to people, they've got these MAGA flags and Trump 2020 and Trump 2024 flags hanging up, and these are what these working class Americans, these people that are out there sweating and beating themselves to death daily to put food on their table, are the MAGA Republicans that Joe Biden was referring to. And when he talks about right wingers needing an F-15 versus an AR-15 to defend themselves against the government, and then he gets up there with that ominous red and black background and the military guard standing there after he's decimated the American military with COVID shot mandates and things like that, and kicking people out of the military for not getting the jab and things. So to me, that speech was very ominous. It was very dark. It was charged with hate. It was charged with anger for people that Joe Biden, frankly, does not like. So when Joe Biden talks about being a uniter, and Joe Biden talks about, trying to to bridge this partisan divide, in my opinion, from the time he started campaigning for the 2020 election, Joe Biden has been a divider. And that's the way that I see it. I can't see it any other way when I look at him, when I hear him talk about Trump supporters, and the fact that Trump still lives rent free in his head every second of the day is pretty disturbing.
Mm-hmm. So also something that we see things differently, but I think that I did watch the speech. I didn't reread it, and so I don't have the, but I generally get the sense of what it was about and what people were upset about. You know, I think that we came close to overturning our democratic system of government last year. I think the January 6th hearings revealed how close that was. You know, Trump's efforts to seat electoral college electors who did not represent the winners of their states, you know, trying to threaten secretaries of states to find votes to win, you know, pushing the vice president to nullify 2 centuries of constitutional rule and then sicking a lynch mob against him when he refused. Like, these were unprecedented attacks on our democracy. I don't have sympathy for the people who were rioting at the Capitol. You know, I think that there was a genuine effort to subvert our democracy, because, you know, I do think that, you know, we need to, how do I put this? There has to be a basis of things that we agree on. And I think we spoke about it at the beginning of this conversation. We have to be playing by the same rules. We can disagree and have really passionate disagreements, right? But if we start saying that, well, we don't actually think that like elections are fair if the other side wins, then that is a threat to democracy, right? Because imagine if we did that, right? It would be just as tyrannical. And Democrats don't do it. That hasn't happened. Otherwise, Al Gore in 2000 would have, you know, why would he have taken it to the Supreme Court when he could have just declared himself the winner, right? Like, we can't have a country like this if this is the way that things are going to go. And one of the things that I think is remarkable about Joe Biden is that he's been able to pass bipartisan legislation after bipartisan legislation, despite the fact that a majority of House Republicans voted to overturn the election that he won. And he's still able at the same time to pass all this legislation. And I think that, you know, be him defending democracy while also governing, he can walk and chew gum at the same time. I understand that a lot of people were offended by it. I would say that, and I saw people saying, you know, this isn't like, you know, to quote Abraham Lincoln, right, with malice towards none, right? And I think a lot of people felt this malice, right? But Abraham Lincoln gave that speech after insurgents that tried to rebel against the country were defeated. And I think there are people who remain committed to trying to overturn our democracy and try to continue the things that were happening on January 6th by other means in the next elections, whether it's trying to just find different flexible ways to go around the democratic rule. So because I do think that is a genuine threat. I do think he was speaking to it legitimately, and that I hope that, you know, a lot of the things that he was describing, I don't think most people are that kind of the MAGA Republican when you actually ask it, because I think someone like you probably agrees with me, right? That, you know, Mike Pence shouldn't have, like, Mike Pence probably shouldn't have overturned the election, right? Right.
Oh, I said as much in the last conversation. I don't believe that was the right move. I also don't believe that what happened on January 6th was an insurrection. It certainly wasn't an armed insurrection, because there was thousands upon thousands of people there, and only a very small portion of the people that were there tried to gain access to the Capitol. And the reality is this, Jordan: if Republicans, who are the majority of Republicans in this country, have firearms, and a lot of them, if it was an actual armed insurrection, there would have been a lot of people there with guns, which there weren't. They call it armed insurrection because people had flags and flagpoles, and I think maybe one guy had a pocket knife, but there was no weapons displayed by any Republicans. The thing got out of hand. It was a riot. It was wrong, but it was not an armed insurrection. If there was an armed insurrection, a lot of people would die. The only person that died that day was a Republican Trump supporter who was shot by Capitol Police. So I mean, we're going to disagree on that, and that's fine. I think what happened that day was abhorrent. It was stupid. There was a lot of people who acted very stupidly, and but calling it an armed insurrection is basically calling it something that it was not.
Would you concede that there was a threat to democracy?
I would
Trump denying the election results and then trying to get the results overturned?
Yeah, well, I've heard a lot of people say that Trump led an insurrection and stuff like that. I think that's a very, very poor way to describe what happened. I think Trump did what Trump does. He got crowds charged up, but a threat to our democracy. I really don't. I mean, I think if it was a true threat to our democracy, Nancy Pelosi would have had the National Guard there as was requested. There are a lot of things that have been misrepresented about January 6th. I think the vast majority of people in this country don't have any clue what really happened on January 6th. They see the little snippets. They see the smoke. They see the broken windows. They see people trying to scale the wall. But the fact that it was probably less than 1% of the total number of people. It was far less than 1% of the total number of people that were out there that day. I think it was a charged up group of people, and then a very, very, very minute number of those people that didn't actually represent the total crowd made it into a mess. I don't see it I see it as a dark stain on this country's history, just like so many things are. But I don't see what happened that day as a threat to democracy. Mike Pence knew what he was going to do. He did what he should have done. And we need to move on as a country. I think it's been blown up into something that it's not.
Well, we did find common ground, but I think we'll agree to disagree.
Okay.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap this conversation up. And I really appreciate just the passion and patience and compassion that both of you brought to this conversation. So I guess I'd just give each of you take 30 seconds to a minute and tell our listeners, how did you feel about our work together here today? I'll start with you, Jordan.
I really enjoyed it. I think that, it's important to have people challenge your priors and your a lot of the comfortable kind of demeanor or comfortable disposition that I think is really easy to kind of get stuck in when you're, in your comfort zone, always hearing from people who you agree with. And, it's important to in order to understand how you really feel, you need somebody else there, somebody who is also an American, and a reminder that we're all in this together in the same country, to challenge you on it and make you think about it. And you probably will still feel the same way, but you're going to be able to come at it from a different point. And, I think that is, what Braver Angels is all about. The work that you guys are doing is important for that reason. So because, I feel good now.
Wilk, how about you?
I thought it was an incredible conversation. I think Jordan's a great guy, and just the fact that we were able to have such a civil conversation. Like I said, like I've said so many times on whether it be this forum or my forum or in different places, just because it's a contentious topic doesn't mean it has to be a contentious conversation. And I think more people just need to really realize that, we can come away from this conversation, both Jordan and I, knowing that, yeah, maybe we didn't change each other's mind on anything. We talked about some very real issues. We had a civil discussion doing it. We know where each other stands, but we don't have to dislike each other or be at each other's throat because of it. And it's so important. So I want to echo his point. Braver Angels is doing such good work to make things like this happen. And the more that we can scale this, I watched, I read a lot of those comments from our last conversation, Kieran, and a lot of them were, well, frankly, they were dishonest, but they were very, very charged and angry comments towards me specifically, which is fine. I get that a lot, and I'm not opposed to that. That's one of the reasons I started the Derate the Hate podcast. But it doesn't matter that everybody's not going to like this conversation, because there are going to be people on the right that think I should have been more aggressive towards Jordan. And there are going to be people on the left that think Jordan should have been more aggressive towards me. But the reality is we talked about a lot. There was a lot of substance to this conversation. We were very civil, and I'm feeling good too. I'm feeling good too.
Good. I'm feeling good too. That was well put. And Wilk, I sympathize as a host of a podcast getting angry emails, but we also do get emails from people who tell us that they really appreciate the value of what we're doing. And I think there's a lot of listeners out there who might not write in, but really do get value from these conversations. And so I'm always heartened by that. And on that note, we always want to hear what folks think. So send us an email at media@braverangels.org. Let us know what you thought of this conversation. I can forward along responses to Wilk and Jordan. Maybe the three of us will jump back on the mic at some point. The midterms are coming up. Braver Angels is growing. Politics is heating up. And it's a pleasure to be doing something that we feel can be of service to the country. So we invite you to join the conversation. Let us know what you think, and join us next time on the Braver Angels podcast.